Hey everybody, thanks for joining White Dog Outdoors and an advanced video in our urine nymphing series. This video is going to assume that you've seen our urine nymphing series and you understand the basics of urine nymphing. So if you haven't seen that, I definitely recommend you start there. I'll link the entire urine nymphing series down below. One of the most common comments we get on the channel is, how do I know what flies to select? I think it's an overwhelming process for people, and so we're going to break that down in today's video. But before we get started, just a couple of quick things. I want to thank everybody for all the support that you provided for the channel. We've been having a phenomenal time doing this channel, and I know that you guys are really enjoying the content that we're putting out. We've had a lot of people asking how they support us. We really didn't have a way to do that, but now we have the White Dog Pack. It's a White Dog membership. I'll leave a link down below. It'll get you access to some exclusive content. Everything that you guys give to us helps us produce the content that we're producing, and it helps us help more people. One of the other things that we've done is we've opened a White Dog online shop. So I'll leave the link down below to that shop, but you can buy merchandise there. We have plenty of White Dog trucker hats in different colors. We have the White Dog winter Carhartt hat, which is great for the winter, except today's 50 degrees in the end of December. I don't really need my Carhartt hat today, so I'm down to the trucker hat. The other thing that we're doing is we're selling hand-tied flies. These are flies that are tied by White Dog guides only. They're tied to very specific specifications, and if you go on the website, you'll see that each fly tells you the size bead that it's tied with, how much lead is in that fly, and the exact weight in milligrams of how heavy that fly is. It's something that other shops don't do that I think is important for people who are really into urine nymphing, so go and check them out there. I do expect a lot of demand, and so we'll do our best to keep up, but hey, enough of that for now. Let's get to our fly selection video. All right, when it comes to fly selection, I think we need to start at the very beginning. How would we possibly know what flies we should be putting on our line if we don't understand the food sources that are in our rivers? And so that is the number one thing when starting to understand what flies I want to select, is I need to understand what food sources are in my various streams. There are certain streams where certain flies do really, really well. And there are other streams where those flies will never get a take from a fish, and it has to do with the types of insects and the other things that are living in your particular rivers. So the number one thing is, go out, go check out your rivers, go start flipping rocks and start to see what kind of bugs are in those rivers. Right? Certain rivers maybe are going to have more of the smaller mayflies, or maybe some caddis, and then other ones are going to have some bigger flies, like big stone flies, and you might see some other large flies as well. Start to understand what types of flies are in those rivers, and if there's a lot of big flies, like they have certain rivers where you flip rocks and you get all these huge stone flies. Well, I'm putting on a sexy stone fly for my point fly then, aren't I? Right? And in those rivers, that sexy stone fly absolutely crushes. All right, if I'm seeing a lot of smaller nymphs, maybe I need to focus on some smaller type nymphs that are going to imitate the things that I'm finding in the water, right? The other thing is, it's not just insects that the fish are feeding on. There's other things in the water, especially that big fish will feed on. And so take a look, start flipping rocks, move things around, take a look. Do I see crayfish? Right? If I see crayfish, that might be a really good time to throw a jig streamer in a crayfish color, have it bouncing along the bottom, and I bet you that's going to trigger a really big fish. Do you see a lot of minnows? Right? What do those minnows look like? Try to imitate those types of food sources with your flies, and that's going to help you understand at least where you should start. So there's a term in fly fishing called match the hatch, and I think it can be confusing for people in fly fishing as to when they actually need to try and match a hatch. So it comes down to understanding the bug life in the rivers. We go into depth in this on volume 1 in our urine nymphing series, but in the basic form, 99% of the bug's life cycle is going to be spent as a nymph underwater, a nymph or a larva underwater. And when it comes down to a very specific moment in time, when you have the right water temperature, when you have the right sunlight, when you have the right time of year, that is going to trigger that nymph to change from that nymph phase into a dry fly. And so that nymph will either crawl out on the rocks, or they're going to be swimming up to the surface to basically go through its change and become a dry fly. And so that is the match the hatch. That's when a very specific moment in time, when a very specific fly is engaging in a particular activity to become a dry fly, and the trout will really, really key on those hatches when they're happening. But when you're nymphing, you're typically not trying to imitate that hatch. You're trying to imitate the food source in the 99% of its life cycle in the water or on the bottom. That's what you're trying to do when you're nymphing. So in nymphing, you're not typically trying to match the hatch. You're trying to match the food source. So that's why we say that presenting a fly in the right way is more important than the specific fly that you're choosing. As long as you're closely matching the food sources that are in the river, you don't need to match the specific fly that's hatching at that given time. You want to be, there are so many food sources in this river. That's why a lot of the basic patterns work most of the time. So presenting the fly is going to by far be the most important thing when it comes to fly selection. So when I'm choosing my flies, we're going to get into this in depth a little bit later, but when I'm choosing my flies, I'm more choosing my flies based on the water conditions than I am any specific fly activity. Now, I'm still going to match my food sources, but I'm going to choose my flies based on the conditions of the water. Now, there are cases where a fly does matter. I've definitely had certain days where a certain fly definitely tends to be outfishing all of the others. And so the only thing I say about that is always be paying attention, always be aware of what's getting you success, and keep adapting what you're doing. Keep changing flies to get the right drift. Keep changing flies to get the right presentation. If you're not getting hit, change flies and see if you can get them to key on something else, right? So I've definitely had days where I've drifted by fish over and over again, didn't get the bite, I've changed flies, and then I've gotten the bite. I think that's probably more an exception than a rule. I think in general your basic patterns are going to produce, but I just always be paying attention, always understand what's going on and putting the pieces together. That's what's really going to make a good fisherman, is putting all those pieces together and figuring things out. So now that we understand more about the food sources in our rivers, and we understand more about the bug life in our rivers and how we're going to go and figure out what that bug life is, let's start to talk about how are we going to build a fly box with a variety of flies to be able to imitate those different flies and be able to cover ourselves in all sorts of different situations. So I typically break my flies down into what I call 4 characteristics. The first one is size. How big is the fly? You know, a lot of times that's going to be based on the hook size or just, you know, how much material is hanging off of it. The second is going to be weight. How heavy is that fly? And I will actually use a scale that's going to tell me how many milligrams that particular fly is. The third is profile. So what's the profile of that fly? Is it a squirmy worm with long tentacles hanging off? Is it a stonefly with some legs hanging off? Or is it a more compact nymph, like maybe a perdigon that has nothing hanging off of it and it's just a bullet that's going to drop down to the bottom? And the fourth is color. And so obviously we can have different kind of colors. A lot of times we'll have hot spots that are going to help fish key on or see that, or sometimes we'll go very natural in certain situations to present more of a natural imitation of those flies. So why don't we dig in and let's take a look at the flies that are in our fly box. All right, so let's take a look at, a typical fly box, and we'll talk about the different flies and the different characteristics of flies and how there's a variety in this fly box. So first I'm going to start with some of the bigger profile flies. I've got a couple of different colors of squirmy worms. Squirmy worms are a great fly. I mean, if you can consider them a fly, but obviously they're going to imitate a worm, and there are definitely situations in which squirmy worms absolutely crush. Again, they are a bigger profile fly, and I'll tell you, a lot of times bigger fish are oftentimes going to go for a bigger meal. Nothing is 100% in fly fishing or in life, I guess, either, but more often than not, in fact, way more often than not, I'm finding I'm catching my bigger fish on bigger flies. So squirmy worms are incredibly good flies. Again, those are going to be big profile flies. We're going to talk about the situations in which these flies perform really, really well. Another larger profile fly is a stonefly. And so this is my sexy stonefly. This one is the bomb version. It's very, very heavy. This is a great point fly to help get me down. I do tie it in lighter versions as well. But this is another really good big fish catcher, as well as all other fish as well. But it just, any time that you are seeing bigger flies in the water, things like stoneflies or other big mayflies, these are absolute killers in those particular waters. You know, some waters, they don't hold those big stones, and so if I put on a big stonefly in certain waters, I will not get a bite. But in a lot of waters, they absolutely crush, and they crush big fish. Okay. Another big profile fly that's not imitating a bug, but it's imitating either a crayfish or a minnow is what we call a jig streamer, and these are typically tied with pretty heavy beads. This is a very big bead. It's a tungsten bead. It's pretty heavy, and it's basically going to jig along the bottom, and it's going to imitate a minnow or a crayfish. And these are also very good big fish catchers. Typically, you're going to use these when fish are willing to move. Fish are not always willing to move, so if they're willing to move, this is a great option. All right, now we get into what I would consider more of our normal size nymphs, right? So these are going to imitate more of the normal size flies that are in a river. When you flip over rocks, you are going to see a ton of flies that are about this size, right? So these are size 14s. I think, 14s and 16s are probably typically your normal size here. And these are very imitative of different types of flies. This one here is the ice dub peacock. It's a very good color for imitating a lot of those nymphs. I put a colored bead on it to give it a little bit of take a little more notice for the fish. Caddis are a great one to always have in your box. These are, we talked about before, anytime you see a green worm in the water, that's a caddis. And a lot of times you'll see a case caddis where they actually build a little rock shell, and they kind of are peeking out of that. It's called a peeking caddis. But caddis are a great fly to have. These here are waltz worms. These imitate, any type of nymph, but also different types of worms that are in the water. I've had days where these ones absolutely crush. This set here is a set of Frenchies. It's just a pheasant tail with a little hot spot with a little pink dubbing. You can tie them without the hot spot too, and these are great. They're just pheasant tails. And these are your typical average size, typical nymphs that are going to perform well in just about any waters that you have. I don't have too many soft tackles. I got a couple of soft tackles in here. These are blowtorches. Basically, they have a little bit of a CDC soft tackle in here. And when you're fishing these, it adds more movement into the water. You're going to see those little fibers move as it goes in the water, and it just helps create a little more enticement for the fish. And when we talk about the sink rates and stuff like that, the more you have in terms of surface area with these little fibers, the more it affects the sink rate of the fly. So these are typical average size nymphs. Then you get into smaller nymphs, and so these are all what we call perdigons, and I'll explain a little bit about what that means, but you can go even smaller than these. These are all size 16, but people tie, you'll hear midges or brassies or perdigons, and these are size 16. They have a hard shell coating on the outside of them, so there's no surface area like with these, where there's all this dubbing. There's nothing like that. These are a hard shell coating, and so there's no resistance in the water when they hit the water, and they drop pretty easily. They're typically a little bit lighter, a little bit smaller. You can put bigger beads on these and make them heavier. But we're going to talk about where perdigons really shine in different types of water as well. So, these are the typical types of flies that I'm going to have. I'm going to have some bigger profiles. I'm going to have some jig nymphs. I'm going to have some standard ones. I'm going to have some soft tackles, and I'm going to have some perdigons. And maybe even some, like little brassies or some smaller midge type flies as well. So now it's important when you're out on the water and you're looking in those, and you're looking and flipping rocks and seeing what bugs exist. Take a sample of those bugs, see what they look like, match them up to what's in your fly box, and that's how we're gonna start figuring out what the best options are for fish. We're going to look to see, You know, are we seeing big stoneflies? We're going to put on some stoneflies. Are we seeing a lot of average size nymphs? We're going to try maybe the iced-up peacock, or maybe a waltz worm, or maybe a Frenchie. And then are we seeing some caddis? Look above. Do you see any caddis flying around? Do you see any green worm like caddis in the water? We're going to put on a caddis. If you're seeing a lot of smaller stuff, you can put on some of these, like some of the midges, or the zebra midge, or some of these paragons. And so that is really going to help you key into what should I be putting on for my different types of river, and everything is a starting point, right? So as we're fishing, we're going to be paying attention to what's happening, we're going to be adapting, and we're going to be figuring things out. All right, so let's talk about one of the really important characteristics of a fly, and that's weight. One of my biggest issues with buying flies online is that it's so hard to know how heavy these flies are, and weight is going to be really, really important to be able to fish effectively and be able to choose the flies that are going to really make sense for you. And so one of my biggest problems is that online retailers almost never tell you the weight of the flies. In fact, most of them won't even tell you the size of the bead that's on those flies, and they're not going to tell you if there's any lead wrapped into those flies. So one of the big things I tell people is, just because you see a bigger fly, do not assume that a bigger fly means that it's heavier. You don't know how that fly was tied unless they specifically tell you. So number one, what size bead is it using? Is it using a tungsten bead? Is there any lead wrapped into that body? These are all things that are going to affect the weight of the fly, right? And so when you're online and you're looking to buy flies, look for those types of things. What size beads am I using? Are they tungsten beads, and how much weight is tied into those? Will they actually tell you how heavy your flies are? That's one of the big things. You know, when I started to sell flies just recently, it was really important to me that we showed the exact weight of the flies, and that I gave you every detail about how this is tied. I tell you the size of the bead, I tell you what size lead I'm putting on the body, and I'm telling you the exact weight of the fly. I think that's really important to be able to figure out what flies you want and how to be able to fish them effectively. So let's go through the different flies in the box and their weights of the flies. So first of all, this is a micro scale. I'll link this in the description. There's a particular one that I use, but it doesn't really matter as long as you're using a micro scale that's accurate. And we'll turn this guy on. And this is going to measure in milligrams. And so let's start with some of the smaller flies. Let's start with like one of my zebra paragons here, and we'll throw this guy on. I don't like that one. I'm very picky. All right, so here's a zebra paragon. It's just a little over 200 milligrams, so it's at 0.2 grams. So we're just a little over 200 milligrams. This is pretty light for a fly, for a nymph, and this is using a tungsten bead. There's no lead in it. And you know, this is around 200 milligrams, just a little over 200 milligrams. That's where most of my paragons are going to come in. This is a size 16 using a 7/64 or 2.8 millimeter bead. Okay, so we'll see where that one is. Let's take one of my iced peacocks and see where that comes in. Now we're getting into more of my standard flies. So this one here is 385 milligrams. Most of my standard flies are going to be right around that same mark of somewhere between 385 and 400 milligrams. So we've almost doubled the weight, even though the size of the fly is almost the same in terms of it's a little bulkier on the one, but this iced up peacock is almost twice as heavy. Let's take a look at one of our caddis. This one should be right around that, yep, 386, almost 390. And so again, pretty close to that range. We'll throw on one of our waltz worms. This one's 398, so again, close to 400. And so that's pretty typical. Most of my average size nymphs are going to be right around that same weight. Now when I throw a Frenchie on, this one's going to be a little bit different. It's using the same size bead, but is using a different size lead. I'm not using as heavy a lead on this, and so I know when I put on my Frenchie, it's going to be slightly lighter. Okay, so now we're right around 330 milligrams for my Frenchie. Okay, so we went from 200 milligrams with the paragons up to about 400 milligrams with the regular kind of size nymphs. And then let's go to a squirmy. And here we are, we're 830 milligrams basically. So we doubled in size from the paragon to the regular size nymphs, and we doubled in weight, I should say. And we've doubled in weight again from the regular nymph to the squirmy worm. And so, you know, I'm starting to understand, I'm starting to see what weights my fly box has and what they are. If I didn't have these weights, I really wouldn't know, right? And so I think it's really important to just understand those basics. Okay, now let's go to the sexy bomb. This guy is tied incredibly heavy. This has 2 tungsten beads on it and heavy lead wraps. And this one is over a gram, so it's 1,050 milligrams. So again, we've added a couple hundred milligrams to this fly in a much more compact form factor. So the profile is smaller on this, but packs a ton of weight. So when I am in fast or high water and I really need to get down, or I need to get down into deep water, this is my point fly. This is really going to help get me down when I really need to get down, right? And then sometimes if I'm in high or off color water, I'll couple the Sexy Stone Bomb with the Pink Squirmy, and these guys crush together. You look, we're almost 2 grams between the 2 of these. You're gonna get so much feel when you put these flies on because they're so heavy and they have big profiles. You're really gonna feel them. Not perfect in every situation, but in certain situations, they're gonna be great. And that's what we're gonna talk about, is really understanding what flies to use in what particular situations. All right, we are going to hit the pause button for now. As with all my videos, there's just a lot of information I want to share with you guys, and I want to keep them in bite-sized chunks. So this fly selection video is going to become a 2-part mini-series, and part 2 is going to be a really cool video. We're going to be doing a lot of really interesting topics that I think are really important. We're going to be talking about sink rates, and we're going to do a little science experiment to show how different flies sink at different rates, and how it's not just weight that matters when you're trying to get a fly down to the bottom. And we're going to talk about the weight of the flies and the profile of the flies, how that affects the drift and how it affects how you feel things. And then we're going to get to a really important topic of when you're detecting strikes, how am I going to detect those strikes? Is it going to be sight? Is it going to be feel? Or is it going to be a combination of the two? And in what situations am I more likely to have one versus another? Then we're going to dive in and talk about different types of water and in what situations am I going to be selecting what types of flies. And I think this is really important. And like I said earlier in the video, when I get to the water, I'm matching the food source, but I'm trying to select my flies based on the type of water that's in front of me. We're going to dive into all of that. And then we're going to break down some more stuff on fly boxes. I'll show you guys a little more detail on my fly box, how I organize my fly box, and some fly tying tips. And I definitely appreciate all the support we've received throughout the years. If you want to support the channel, if you want to support our mission, I hope you'll consider being a part of the White Dog Pack. I'll leave a link down below so you can see what that looks like. And then we have our online store with we've got a lot of hats on there, both summer and winter hats, as well as some other stuff. And of course, our hand-tied flies. And I know that's going to be a big thing. We're already selling out of a lot of them. We've been tying like crazy. We'll do our best to keep up. But I definitely appreciate all the support through that. And then there's going to be a big announcement coming soon. When we hit 25,000 subscribers, I want to do something really big. And so when we hit 10,000, we gave away a fly rod and we did some really cool stuff. We're going to be blowing it out again. I want to do some really cool things when we hit 25,000. So I hope you guys will subscribe and follow us for all of our adventures and everything that we're doing as we lead up to that big giveaway. But hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I appreciate everything that you guys do to support us. And we will see you soon for Volume 2 of our Fly Selection mini-series.